Okay, so welcome to chapter 3. I am going to go. I'm going to start today's lesson with a question, and I am going to tell you a story so that you can kind of like understand this better. So, question that I want you to consider is what truths would be lost if there were no fiction? So, we live in a digital age right now where you can pretty much go online and find the truth about whatever it is that you want, either using AI or Google your own research. It's the kind of idea of if we're looking for concrete answers, they are very readily available. And I will tell you from my own experience when I was in high school, the way that we used to get information was a very slow, dogged process, often unreliable because you didn't necessarily have access to all of the information. You might only have access to your little library in East Cobb, Georgia, where you grew up, which was a great library, don't get me wrong. But obviously, if you wanted to really delve deeply into some sort of a research project, you might have to go and like go to other libraries and request book transfers. And sometimes you got them and sometimes you didn't. So the access to the quote unquote truth that exists was actually a lot different when I was younger, which is good and bad. So if we think about the idea of truths, there is this I would say modern equivalent to a nihilism about the idea of truth. Because we have access to all of the information, concrete information, it feels as though you can go online, and we talked about this in Fahrenheit 451, and kind of find whatever thing that you want to find to prove your point, right? When I was a debate coach, there was this whole thing about you can go on the internet and basically find anything to use in a research evidence way to prove your point, right? So that leads us to a more interesting question, and that's this one. What truths would be lost if there were no fiction? So I'm actually going to use a story that isn't fiction to relate to you what this idea is. So once upon a time, when I was a little baby teacher, my mentor teacher was teaching a class called AP Lang, and this is a college level course. And he taught this amazing class. He was an amazing rhetorician. He's one of the teachers. He's now principal of a local school of mine, and I greatly admire him. And his kids were extremely smart, but they were also extremely oriented towards rhetoric as a tool. So we look at an essay and we look at argumentation and we look at all of the pieces of it and how do those mechanics work together, right? And so to them, the idea of pathos, which is emotion, was even though Aristotle said it's the strongest, they felt it was the weakest. They really liked logos and they really liked ethos and they liked finding those things. Well, one day when I was during my planning period, my mentor teacher was like, "Hey, I got to drop my AP Lang kids off with you. I have to go to this meeting and I just need you to kind of like babysit them. All they're doing is working on this essay and like going through and highlighting where they see ethos, logos, and pathos, right? They're completely self-sufficient to just babysit them." And I was like, absolutely no problem. This was like, I think my second year teaching. So like when I say baby teacher, I mean baby teacher. So these kids come in there and like they're all seniors. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, what is this? Like they're all 6 feet tall. I'm 4'11". So, it was very overwhelming at the time. So they come in, they kind of plop themselves into the desks and they start doing their thing. They don't really pay any attention to me. I'm just sort of sitting behind my desk. And my principal comes in. And my principal at the time was this kind of larger than life figure. He would come onto the announcements and in the morning and basically just talk for 10 or 15 minutes. And everyone listened with like rapt attention to what this man was saying because he was extremely wise. Like he was a principal for many years and then retired. And then my school needed someone to kind of step in the interim, and he volunteered to come in. And we were lucky to have him for the years that we had him. But he was very much a larger than life principal. And he came into my classroom to observe me. Well, he didn't know it was my planning period. And he also didn't know that I was babysitting my mentor teacher's kids. And so he comes in and he looks at my board. And on the board, I always had two questions. So I would have an abstract question and then I would have a skill-based question that was linked to the standards. And all he really paid attention to was the abstract question. And this, what you see in front of you, what truths would be lost if there were no fiction, was the abstract question. And so he's checking in on a baby teacher to make sure that I'm doing my job. And he asks my students what they thought the essential question, that big abstract question, what truths would be lost if there were no fiction, actually meant. Now, keep in mind that these kids are not reading fiction. They're reading nonfiction rhetorical essays, and they're going through and doing some of the most mechanical work of nonfiction rhetorical essays, and that is highlighting all of the different pieces for it. But they had a conversation with this man and they made me look so good, even though they weren't my kids. They had absolutely nothing to do with fiction that day. And they had this long, in-depth 20-minute conversation with my principal about what truths would be lost if there were no fiction. And they had excellent ideas and excellent answers and fantastic questions. And it was one of those moments in which I, as a teacher, became a student because when they started having this conversation with him, they were using their own experiences and narratives to explain how they felt about these things. And it was sincere and it was honest. And I learned a great deal about how much fiction reading, in-depth fiction reading, meant to kids like this. Now, keep in mind, this was like, oh my gosh, this was like almost 20 years ago. I'm old. So this was like a lot longer time ago than if you think about how much technology has changed in the past, like even past decade with AI and all of those things. So their understanding was not the same level of research understanding that I had when I was a high schooler, but it definitely, internet has changed a lot of things, right? So it's interesting that we start with this idea of what truths would be lost if there were no fiction, specifically for chapter three, because chapter three explores this very like Alice through the looking glass, not Alice in Wonderland, but Alice through the looking glass understanding of what identity means. Is identity concrete, or are we as human beings constantly reflecting back our past as well as what we want to be in the future? And then simultaneously, all the people around us, do they reflect back to us what we are trying to reflect forward to them? And if we are I'm going to borrow a quote from the novel, if we are a series of successful gestures, then what even really is identity, right? When we think about the things that we read, fiction makes us do this really cool thing, and that is that we have to step into the footsteps of a character and experience their world. And when we do that, we kind of like add on to our own experience of the world at large. Okay. This whole construct of being able to understand the world through experience is going to lead us to part of the novel that has to do with the Proustian metaphor or the Proustian Madeline. This is one of my favorite things to explore, and it's a really complex concept. So if at first you don't get it, don't worry. Take a little bit of time. I strongly encourage you to start exploring the idea of the Proustian Madeline and how all of it relates together after this. And I strongly recommend that you do it by reading all of the things and watching all of the things and coming up with your own concept of it. So that's what we're going to do with this particular chapter, chapter three. If you want some anchor material for this particular chapter, remember our colors, right? And that is that blue almost always represents the idea of enlightenment, and that yellow is supposed to be the idea of like tainted purity, right? So white would be like the bright light of enlightenment. It's so bright, it's like bright white and it's blinding, just like when you come out of Plato's allegory of the cave, you come out of the cave and you see the real sun for the first time, not just like a fire that's inside of a cave. It's blinding, right? You like come out, you're like, right? It's just really, really painful. And you have to like rub your eyes because it's like it's a difficult awakening, if you will. So bright white light is the light of enlightenment. Blue is the light of enlightenment. And then yellow is the tainted version of that, right? So gold would be the tainted version of the ideal, right? So if you think of things that are gold, that's going to be also that kind of like tainted purity. Okay. So let's dive in. We'll be talking a lot about the idea of the Platonic conception of identity. And you're going to hear sort of this. I'm going to talk a little bit about moths and things like that. And then also another anchor image is the concept of time and how it relates to the Proustian metaphor. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into it. Chapter 3.
Chapter 3. There was music from my neighbor's house through the summer nights. In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths among the whisperings and the champagne. and the stars. At high tide in the afternoon, I watched his guests diving from the tower of his raft, or taking the sun on the hot sand of his beach while his two motorboats slit the waters of the Sound, drawing aquaplanes over cataracts of foam. On weekends, his Rolls-Royce became an omnibus, bearing parties to and from the city between 9 in the morning and long past midnight, while his station wagon scampered like a brisk yellow bug to meet all trains. And on Mondays, 8 servants, including an extra gardener, toiled all day with mops and scrubbing brushes and hammers and garden shears, repairing the ravages of the night before. Every Friday, 5 crates of oranges and lemons arrived from a fruiterer in New York. Every Monday, these same oranges and lemons left his back door in a pyramid of pulpless halves. There was a machine in the kitchen which could extract the juice of 200 oranges in half an hour if a little button was pressed 200 times by a butler's thumb.
Okay, so when we think about the idea of what is happening, Gatsby's parties are supposed to feel as though they are never ending. All right. So we have this like Monday through Friday cycle, but even after the Monday through Friday cycle of all of these party goers ends, we have people that are coming in that are the servants of the house. And what is their job? Their job is to clean up the mess and then also to get everything ready for the parties of the next week. So it is this like perpetual cycle of partying that is taking place at Gadsby's house. Now, I'm sure you noticed the blue gardens. Why? Because this is the concept of enlightened experience of time. Gadsby is living in no time. There is no ending point. Now, if you think about the idea of the modern work week is Monday through Friday and then weekends, which by the way, we had to kind of fight for that, just FYI. So we have this like perpetual cycle of never ending partying and joy. And that means that Gatsby's mansion exists in a place that is timeless. But there's also the exploitation. So we have these like pulped fruit pieces as well as the butler. Remember, we talked about the butler's nose in that first chapter. The butler who is in charge of pressing a button 200 times in order for everything to be juiced. And that pulp at the end that we just heard, that's supposed to be kind of like what's left over after human beings after they're going through this kind of like cycle, right? So like it's kind of the Valley of Ashes, but it's like the rich person version of it. There's just like not a lot left over through this party cycle. But remember, for Gadsby, the party never ends.
At least once a fortnight, a corps of caterers came down with several hundred feet of canvas and enough colored lights to make a Christmas tree of Gatsby's enormous garden. On buffet tables garnished with glistening hors d'oeuvre, spiced baked hams crowded against salads of harlequin designs and pastry pigs and turkeys bewitched to a dark gold. In the main hall, a bar with a real brass rail was set up, and stocked with gins and liquors and with cordials so long forgotten that most of his female guests were too young to know one from another. By 7 o'clock the orchestra has arrived. No thin 5-piece affair, but a whole pit full of oboes and trombones and saxophones and viols and cornets and piccolos, and low and high drums. The last swimmers have come in from the beach now and are dressing upstairs. The cars from New York are parked 5 deep in the drive, and already the halls and salons and verandas are gaudy with primary colors and hair shorn in strange new ways and shawls beyond the dreams of Castile. The bar is in full swing, and floating rounds of cocktails permeate the garden outside, until the air is alive with chatter and laughter and casual innuendo and introductions forgotten on the spot, and enthusiastic meetings between women who never knew each other's names. The lights grow brighter as Earth lurches away from the sun, and now the orchestra is playing yellow cocktail music, and the opera of voices pitches a key higher.
So if you want like a cool literary term, that's called synesthesia, the yellow cocktail music. So yellow being corrupt, right? And it's the idea that basically, even though there is this like perpetual cycle of partying, there's no real sincerity to it. So people are connecting with each other, but they're never going to see this person again. And like the connection is very shallow, all right? Which, if you're thinking about the idea of just like this being a perpetual party, of course the connection is shallow because they don't have time to like sit down and have have a real conversation with each other. They're just sort of there to like listen to music and dance and eat all of this food, right? Supposed to be very much like, this decadent version of heaven.
Laughter is easier minute by minute, spilled with prodigality, tipped out at a cheerful word. The groups change more swiftly, swell with new arrivals, dissolve and form in the same breath. Already there are wanderers, confident girls, who weave here and there among the stouter and more stable, become for a sharp, joyous moment the center of a group, and then, excited with triumph, glide on through the sea change of faces and voices and color under the constantly changing light. Suddenly, one of these gypsies in trembling opal seizes a cocktail out of the air, dumps it down for courage, and, moving her hands like Frisco, dances out alone on the canvas platform. A momentary hush. The orchestra leader varies his rhythm obligingly for her, and there is a burst of chatter as the erroneous news goes around that she is Gilda Gray's understudy from the Follies. The party has begun. I believe that on the first night I went to Gatsby's house, I was one of the few guests who had actually been invited. People were not invited. They went there. They got into automobiles which bore them out to Long Island, and somehow they ended up at Gatsby's door. Once there, they were introduced by somebody who knew Gatsby, and after they conducted themselves according to the rules of behavior associated with an amusement park. Sometimes they came and went without having met Gatsby at all, came for the party with a simplicity of heart that was its own ticket of admission. I had actually been invited. A chauffeur in a uniform of robin's egg blue crossed my lawn early that Saturday morning with a surprisingly formal note from his employer. The honor would be entirely Gatsby's, it said, if I would attend his little party that night. He had seen me several times, and had intended to call on me long before, but a peculiar combination of circumstances had prevented it. Signed, J. Gatsby, in a majestic hand. Dressed up in white flannels, I went over to his lawn a little after 7, and wandered around rather ill at ease among swirls and eddies of people I didn't know, though here and there was a face I had noticed on the commuting train. I was immediately struck by the number of young Englishmen dotted about, all well-dressed, all looking a little hungry, and all talking in low, earnest voices to solid and prosperous Americans. I was sure that they were selling something, bonds or insurance or automobiles. They were at least agonizingly aware of the easy money in the vicinity and convinced that it was theirs for a few words in the right key. As soon as I arrived, I made an attempt to find my host. But the 2 or 3 people of whom I asked his whereabouts stared at me in such an amazed way, and denied so vehemently any knowledge of his movements that I slunk off in the direction of the cocktail table, the only place in the garden where a single man could linger without looking purposeless and alone. I was on my way to get roaring drunk from sheer embarrassment when Jordan Baker came out of the house and stood at the head of the marble steps, leaning a little backward and looking with contemptuous interest down into the garden. Welcome or not, I found it necessary to attach myself to someone before I should begin to address cordial remarks to the passers-by. "Hello," I roared, advancing toward her. My voice seemed unnaturally loud across the garden. "I thought you might be here," she responded absently as I came up. "I remembered you lived next door to—" She held my hand impersonally, as a promise that she'd take care of me in a minute, and gave ear to 2 girls in twin yellow dresses, who stopped at the foot of the steps. "Hello," they cried together. "Sorry you didn't win." That was for the golf tournament. She had lost in the finals the week before. "You don't know who we are," said one of the girls in yellow, "but we met you here about a month ago." "You've dyed your hair since then," remarked Jordan. And I started, but the girls had moved casually on, and her remark was addressed to the premature moon, produced like the supper, no doubt, out of a caterer's basket. With Jordan's slender golden arm resting in mine, we descended the steps and sauntered about the garden. A tray of cocktails floated at us through the twilight, and we sat down at a table with the 2 girls in yellow and 3 men, each one introduced to us as Mr. Mumble. "Do you come to these parties often?" inquired Jordan of the girl beside her. "The last one was the one I met you at," answered the girl, in an alert, confident voice. She turned to her companion. "Wasn't it for you, Lucille?" It was for Lucille, too. I like to come, Lucille said. I never care what I do, so I always have a good time. When I was here last, I tore my gown on a chair, and he asked me my name and address. Inside of a week, I got a package from Crorier's with a new evening gown in it. Did you keep it? Asked Jordan. Sure I did. I was going to wear it tonight, but it was too big in the bust and had to be altered. It was gas blue with lavender beads. $265. There's something funny about a fellow that'll do a thing like that, said the other girl eagerly. He doesn't want any trouble with anybody. Who doesn't? I inquired. Gatsby. Somebody told me. The two girls and Jordan leaned together, confidentially. Somebody told me they thought he killed a man once. A thrill passed over all of us. The three Mr. Mumbles bent forward and listened eagerly. I don't think it's so much that, argued Lucille skeptically. It's more that he was a German spy during the war. One of the men nodded in confirmation. I heard that from a man who knew all about him, grew up with him in Germany, he assured us positively. Oh no, said the first girl. It couldn't be that, because he was in the American Army during the war. As our credulity switched back to her, she leaned forward with enthusiasm. You look at him sometimes when he thinks nobody's looking at him. I'll bet he killed a man. She narrowed her eyes and shivered. Lucille shivered. We all turned and looked around for Gatsby. It was testimony to the romantic speculation he inspired that there were whispers about him from those who had found little that it was necessary to whisper about in this world.
Okay, so I'm going to take you back to that question we asked at the beginning. What truths would be lost if there were no fiction? So they don't know where Gatsby gets his money. They don't know what Gatsby even probably looks like. They don't really have any idea of who Gatsby actually is. They just sort of show up at this place that is the Blue Gardens of Gatsby, and they're able to have this incredibly good time because the party never stops, right? It is this long, timeless epic of just party all of the time. And these two twin girls are having the conversation about the fact that this feels as though it is great because they don't take anything very seriously. I want you to hold on to the phrase that that one girl said. I never care what I do, so I always have a good time, right? We also hear this quick little story about how she tore her dress and Gatsby gave her a gas blue one. You're starting to associate Gatsby with the color blue. Remember, blue is the idea of enlightenment. And the fact that Gatsby doesn't have a past that they can like pin onto him, that is also the idea of like, if we are not able to say where he comes from, then that means that we might also be able to not say who he actually is. And that leaves Gatsby open to all sorts of possibilities.
World. The first supper, there would be another one after midnight, was now being served, and Jordan invited me to join her own party, who were spread around a table on the other side of the garden. There were 3 married couples and Jordan's escort, a persistent undergraduate given to violent innuendo and obviously under the impression that sooner or later Jordan was going to yield him up her person to a greater or lesser degree. Instead of rambling, this party had preserved a dignified homogeneity and assumed to itself the function of representing the staid nobility of the countryside, East Egg condescending to West Egg, and carefully on guard against its spectroscopic gaiety. Let's get out, whispered Jordan, after a somehow wasteful and inappropriate half-hour. This is much too polite for me. We got up, and she explained that we were going to find the host. I had never met him, she said, and it was making me uneasy. The undergraduate nodded in a cynical, melancholy way. The bar, where we glanced first, was crowded, but Gatsby was not there. She couldn't find him from the top of the steps, and he wasn't on the veranda. On a chance, we tried an important-looking door, and walked into a high Gothic library paneled with carved English oak, and probably transported complete from some ruin overseas. A stout, middle-aged man with enormous owl-eyed spectacles was sitting somewhat drunk on the edge of a great table, staring with unsteady concentration at the shelves of books. As we entered, he wheeled excitedly around and examined Jordan from head to foot. "What do you think?" he demanded impetuously. "About what?" He waved his hand towards the bookshelves. "About that. As a matter of fact, you needn't bother to ascertain. I ascertained. They're real." The books? He nodded. Absolutely real. Have pages and everything. I thought they'd be a nice durable cardboard. Matter of fact, they're absolutely real. Pages and... Here, let me show you. Taking our skepticism for granted, he rushed to the bookcases and returned with Volume 1 of the Stoddard Lectures. See? He cried triumphantly. It's a bona fide piece of printed matter. It fooled me. This fellow's a regular Belasco. It's a triumph. What thoroughness, what realism. Knew when to stop, too. Didn't cut the pages. But what do you want? What do you expect?
Okay, so the idea of what truths would be lost if there were no fiction. These are books inside the library of Gatsby, right? And old Owl Eyes, you'll hear him being referred to as Owl Eyes. Remember, owls are supposed to be wisdom, right? So he says it's a bona fide piece of printed matter. It fooled me. He's a regular Belasco. So Belasco is an allusion to a Broadway producer who was known for his realistic sets. He says that the thoroughness is really interesting because it does have printed material. It's got the pages in it. So if you go to Gatsby's library and you pull a book off the shelf and you open it up, it's got actual words in it. Like they're not just fake books. And Old Owl Eyes is like, I was certain that they would just be like fake books. If you've ever been to like a library and they have those like rich mahogany, right? And they have these fancy books, oftentimes they're just like you open them up and they're not like real or anything. They're just there for show. But these are real and they had printed material. However, comma, they aren't cut pages, right? So that means that actually, if we think about, for my yearbook people, if you think about a way that a book is printed, it's these giant sheets, and the words are printed on these giant sheets, and then they are cut so that each of the piece of the giant sheet becomes a page, right? So like this is a page of the book. And then probably 10 to 12 of these together would be the giant page that all of this is printed on, which means that when you fold it in half, you're supposed to cut the ends of it. Well, these books aren't cut, so they're not actually real. No one's actually reading them because you actually can't. They have printed material, but because the pages aren't cut, you can't actually print them. So they seem very real, but they're not, right? Um, also important to note that Nick is the only person that Gadsby ever invited. Everyone else just sort of shows up at this never-ending party. And right now, Jordan is trying to find Gadsby for Nick to meet because he's never met Gadsby. And on their way to meet the real Gadsby, they spot this individual in the library who's basically like, I thought this guy was a complete and total fake. And he is to some extent, but most of it's pretty real, right? What truths would be lost if there were no fiction?
He snatched the book from me and replaced it hastily on its shelf, muttering that if one brick was removed, the whole library was liable to collapse. Who brought you? He demanded. Or did you just come? I was brought. Most people were brought. Jordan looked at him alertly, cheerfully, without answering. I was brought by a woman named Roosevelt, he continued. Mrs. Claude Roosevelt. Do you know her? I met her somewhere last night. I've been drunk for about a week now, and I thought it might sober me up to sit in a library. Has it? A little bit, I think. I can't tell yet. I've only been here an hour. Did I tell you about the books? They're real. You told us. We shook hands with him gravely and went back outdoors. There was dancing now on the canvas in the garden. Old men pushing young girls backward in eternal graceless circles. Superior couples holding each other tortuously, fashionably, and keeping in the corners. And a great number of single girls dancing individualistically or relieving the orchestra for a moment of the burden of the banjo or the traps. By midnight, the hilarity had increased. A celebrated tenor had sung in Italian, and a notorious contralto had sung in jazz. And between the numbers, people were doing stunts all over the garden, while happy, vacuous bursts of laughter rose toward the summer sky. A pair of stage twins, who turned out to be the girls in yellow, did a baby act in costume, and champagne was served in glasses bigger than finger bowls. The moon had risen higher, and floating in the sound was a triangle of silver scales, trembling a little to the stiff, tinny drip of the banjos on the lawn. I was still with Jordan Baker. We were sitting at a table with a man of about my age and a rowdy little girl who gave way upon the slightest provocation to uncontrollable laughter. I was enjoying myself now. I had taken 2 finger bowls of champagne, and the scene had changed before my eyes into something significant, elemental, and profound. At a lull in the entertainment, the man looked at me and smiled. "Your face is familiar," he said politely. "Weren't you in the 3rd Division during the war?" "Why, yes, I was in the 9th Machine Gun Battalion." "I was in the 7th Infantry until June of 1918. I knew I'd seen you somewhere before." We talked for a moment about some wet, gray little villages in France. Evidently, he lived in this vicinity, for he told me that he had just bought a hydroplane and was going to try it out in the morning. "Want to go with me, old sport? Just near the shore along the Sound." "What time?" "Any time that suits you best." It was on the tip of my tongue to ask his name when Jordan looked around and smiled. "Having a gay time now?" she inquired. "Much better." I turned again to my new acquaintance. "This is an unusual party for me. I haven't even seen the host. I live over there." I waved my hand at the invisible hedge in the distance. "And this man Gatsby sent over his chauffeur with an invitation." For a moment he looked at me as if he failed to understand. "I'm Gatsby," he said suddenly. "What?" I exclaimed. "Oh, I beg your pardon." "Well, I thought you knew, old sport. I'm afraid I'm not a very good host." He smiled understandingly, much more than understandingly.
Nick meets Gatsby the first time, and he has a good time with Gatsby before even knowing who he is. So, authenticity, right? On top of that, he keeps hearing Gatsby say old sport. And the reason that Gatsby calls Nick old sport is that this to Gatsby is a game. And if you're like, what is this? This is all of the things that Gatsby is doing because he's trying to attract the attention of someone that we have already met, and it's not Nick. So, this whole thing with this perpetual cycle of parties and all of this merrymaking and, hanging out and inviting people to go, go onto his new boat that he's got, all of that is just a game to Gatsby. It's a construction of reality. It's not reality.
It was one of those rare smiles, with a quality of eternal reassurance in it.
Pay attention to all of the references to time in this next description, beginning with eternal reassurance and the whole idea of impressions. What impressions do you get of something?
That you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced, or seemed to face, the whole external world for an instant, and then concentrated on you, with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. It understood you just as far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself, and assured you that it had precisely the impression of you that, at your best, you hoped to convey. Precisely at that point it vanished, and I was looking at an elegant young roughneck, a year or two over 30, whose elaborate formality of speech just missed being absurd. Some time before he introduced himself, I got a strong impression that he was picking his words with care. Almost at the moment when Mr. Gatsby identified himself, a butler hurried toward him with the information that Chicago was calling him on the wire. He excused himself with a small bow that included each of us in turn. "If you want anything, just ask for it, old sport," he urged me. "Excuse me. I will."
Okay, so I just want to go back to that one paragraph. So it says that he is, it's okay. So it says, smiles with the quality of an eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced or seemed to face the whole external world for an instant, and then it concentrated on you. Sounds like Daisy, doesn't it? with an irresistible prejudice in your favor, meaning that when he looks at you as though you are the most interesting person that says the most interesting thing, and you are literally the best version of yourself. He's absolutely fascinated by how wonderful it is that you are here, right? It understood you, meaning that his gaze upon you, understood you just as far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself, and assured you that he had precisely the impression, again, the idea of impression, of you that at your best you hope to convey, right? Precisely at that point, it vanished. And I was looking at an elegant young roughneck, roughneck being someone who like seems to have not been raised in like Daisy or Tom Buchanan's world, right? Seems to be kind of like comes from poverty, kind of sounds like the American dream, pulls himself up by his bootstraps kind of a guy, right? A year or two over 30, whose elaborate formality of speech, the way that he talks is so over the top formal that it sounds absurd. Sometime before he introduced himself, I'd got a strong, there's the word again, impression that he was picking his words with care. So at this moment, Nick has concluded that Gadsby is a persona. He's projecting himself. And to give you a modern day equivalent of this, if you've ever seen someone who constantly posts a particular type of niche or tries to occupy a particular part of the market of Instagram or, like any of the social media sites that you can think of, and they seem to just embody that. Like you go to their page and that's all that they see. That's kind of what Nick is picking up here from Gadsby. He seems to almost be like a marketing image of himself and not a real person. But it's not in a way that's like uncomfortable for Nick. It's almost as though because Gadsby looks at him in this particular way, Gadsby is able to see the marketing version of Nick as well, the best possible version of who Nick is and who Nick wants to present himself as, right? Okay.
We'll rejoin you later. When he was gone, I turned immediately to Jordan, constrained to assure her of my surprise. I'd expected that Mr. Gatsby would be a florid and corpulent person in his middle years. Who is he? I demanded. Do you know? He's just a man named Gatsby. Where is he from? I mean, and what does he do? Now you're started on the subject, she answered with a wan smile. Well, he told me once he was an Oxford man. A dim background started to take shape behind him, but at her next remark it faded away. However, I don't believe it. Why not? I don't know, she insisted. I just don't think he went there. Something in her tone reminded me of the other girls. I think he killed a man, and had the effect of stimulating my curiosity. I would have accepted without question the information that Gatsby sprang from the swamps of Louisiana or from the Lower East Side of New York.
He's got no past. We don't know where he comes from. There's a rumor that's going around that he went to Oxford, but Jordan doesn't buy it. It's almost like the facade of the books again, right? And we hear old Owl Eye say, one brick falls from this particular facade and the whole thing is going to crumble. But there is this idea that like Gatsby says that maybe the Gatsby doesn't say, but remember, everyone's talking about Gatsby, right? So like the way that he's presenting himself is that he's a scholar of some sort, okay? But Jordan doesn't buy it. Okay. So let's just keep going with the idea of like what truths would be lost if there were no fiction.
That was comprehensible. But young men didn't, at least in my provincial inexperience, I believe they didn't, drift coolly out of nowhere and buy a palace on Long Island Sound. Anyhow, he gives large parties, said Jordan, changing the subject with an urban distaste for the concrete. And I like large parties. They're so intimate. At small parties, there isn't any privacy.
Oh, I love this so much. Okay, so again, she says, so Nick describes the way that Jordan is speaking as an urban distaste for the concrete. So Jordan, has a dislike of reality. She doesn't like reality, all right? And then she says this very paradoxical thing about how she loves large parties because they're intimate. If you think of being something intimate, intimate would be like you and your best friend next to the campfire talking about life and all of those things. That would be a very one-on-one conversation that's intimate. And she says that at small parties, there isn't any privacy. But because there are so many people, no one's paying attention to you and the person that you're talking about. So you get to have more intimacy. You can like hide at a large party as opposed to a small party. If you're like, what is she looking at? I'm looking at my notes in my book. You can hide at a large party as opposed to a small party. So there's like paradoxical truth within this fiction that is really, really interesting. But hold on to the idea of like sensation being more realistic than actual penning the reality of it. Where did it go? Sorry.
There was the boom of a bass drum, and the voice of the orchestra leader rang out suddenly above the echolalia of the garden. "Ladies and gentlemen," he cried, "at the request of Mr. Gatsby, we're going to play for you Mr. Vladimir Tostof's latest work, which attracted so much attention at Carnegie Hall last May. If you read the papers, you know there was a big sensation." He smiled with jovial condescension and added, "Some sensation," whereupon everybody laughed. "The piece is known," he concluded lustily, "as Vladimir Tostof's Jazz History of the World." The nature of Mr. Tostof's composition eluded me, because just as it began, my eyes fell on Gatsby, standing alone on the marble steps, and looking from one group to another with approving eyes. His tan skin was drawn attractively tight on his face, and his short hair looked as though it were trimmed every day. I could see nothing sinister about him. I wondered if the fact that he was not drinking helped to set him off from his guests, for it seemed to me that he grew more correct as the fraternal hilarity increased. When the Jazz History of the World was over, girls were putting their heads on men's shoulders in a pup.
So as everyone else is getting drunk, he is becoming more solid. Gadsby is becoming more real as everyone else becomes more dreamlike because Gadsby doesn't drink.
Ish, convivial way. Girls were swooning backward, playfully, into men's arms, even into groups, knowing that someone would arrest their falls. But no one swooned backward on Gatsby. And no French bob touched Gatsby's shoulder, and no singing quartets were formed with Gatsby's head for one link. "I beg your pardon." Gatsby's butler was suddenly standing beside us. "Miss Baker," he inquired. "I beg your pardon, but Mr. Gatsby would like to speak with you alone." "With me?" she exclaimed in surprise. "Yes, madam." She got up slowly, raising her eyebrows at me in astonishment, and followed the butler toward the house. I noticed that she wore her evening dress, all her dresses, like sports clothes. There was a jauntiness about her movements, as if she had first learned to walk upon golf courses on clean, crisp mornings. I was alone, and it was almost 2. For some time, confused and intriguing sounds had issued from a long, many-windowed room which overhung the terrace. Eluding Jordan's undergraduate, who was now engaged in an obstetrical conversation with 2 chorus girls and who implored me to join him, I went inside. The large room was full of people. One of the girls in yellow was playing the piano, and beside her stood a tall, red-haired young lady from a famous chorus, engaged in song. She had drunk a quantity of champagne, and during the course of her song she had decided, ineptly, that everything was very, very sad. She was not only singing, she was weeping too. Whenever there was a pause in the song, she filled it with gasping, broken sobs, and then took up the lyric again, in a quavering soprano. The tears coursed down her cheeks, not freely, however, for when they came into contact with her heavily beaded eyelashes, they assumed an inky color, and pursued the rest of their way in slow black rivulets.
Ugh. She is making everyone else in the party sad because that's the mood that she wants to conduct. And she has these rivulets of mascara that are coming down her cheeks, right? And everyone in the party is being affected by this mood because an emotion is an emotion and is emotion. And it's not necessarily that an emotion is a bad one or a good one. It's just an emotion. And this music and the visuals and the fact that everyone's been drinking, all of these things are swirling swirling together to create this tone. It's a little bit like the whole Edgar Allan Poe Mask of the Red Death multicolored rooms where you go into the blue room and like all of those like all of the drapes and everything is tainted by that light of blue. So in this instance, it's the mix of everything, the food and the alcohol and the music and this woman who's weeping at the piano. Like all of these things are mixing together to make inside this room a particular tone or mood.
A humorous suggestion was made that she sing the notes on her face, whereupon she threw up her hands, sank into a chair, and went off into a deep, vinous sleep. She had a fight with a man who says he's her husband, explained a girl at my elbow. I looked around. Most of the remaining women were now having fights with men said to be their husbands. Even Jordan's party, the quartet from East Egg, were rent asunder by dissension. One of the men was talking with curious intensity to a young actress and his wife, after attempting to laugh at the situation in a dignified and indifferent way, broke down entirely and resorted to flank attacks. At intervals, she appeared suddenly at his side like an angry diamond and hissed, "You promised!" into his ear. The reluctance to go home was not confined to wayward men. The hall was at present occupied by two deplorably sober men and their highly indignant wives. The wives were sympathizing with each other in slightly raised voices. "Whenever he sees me having a good time, he wants to go home. Never heard anything so selfish in my life. We're always the first ones to leave. So are we." "Well, we're almost the last tonight," said one of the men sheepishly. "The orchestra left half an hour ago." In spite of this wives' agreement that such malevolence was beyond credibility, the dispute ended in a short struggle, and both wives were lifted, kicking, into the night. As I waited for my hat in the hall, the door of the library opened and Jordan Baker and Gatsby came out together. He was saying some last word to her, but the eagerness in his manner tightened abruptly into formality as several people approached him to say goodbye.
So Gatsby is himself with Jordan. Remember, she kind of saw through the persona. She's like, I don't think he actually went to Oxford. And as soon as other people perceive Gatsby, he immediately tightens up and he acts Gatsby again.
Jordan's party were calling impatiently to her from the porch, but she lingered for a moment to shake hands. "I've just heard the most amazing thing," she whispered. "How long were we in there?" "Why, about an hour." "It was simply amazing," she repeated, abstractedly. "But I swore I wouldn't tell it, and here I am tantalizing you." She yawned gracefully in my face. "Please come and see me. A phone book, under the name Miss Sigourney Howard, my aunt." She was hurrying off as she talked. Her brown hand waved a jaunty salute as she melted into her party at the door. Rather ashamed that on my first appearance I had stayed so late, I joined the last of Gatsby's guests, who were clustered around him. I wanted to explain that I'd hunted for him early in the evening and to apologize for not having known him in the garden. "Don't mention it," he enjoined me eagerly. "Don't give it another thought, old sport." The familiar expression held no more familiarity than the hand which reassuringly brushed my shoulder. "And don't forget we're going up in the hydroplane tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Then the butler behind his shoulder. "Philadelphia wants you on the phone, sir." "All right, in a minute. Tell him I'll be right there. Good night." "Good night." "Good night." He smiled, and suddenly there seemed to be a pleasant significance in having been among the last to go, as if he had desired it all the time. "Good night, old sport. Good night." But as I walked down the steps, I saw that the evening was not quite over. 50 feet from the door, a dozen headlights illuminated a bizarre and tumultuous scene. In the ditch beside the road, right side up, but violently shorn of one wheel, rested a new coupe, which had left Gatsby's drive not 2 minutes before. The sharp jut of a wall accounted for the detachment of the wheel, which was now getting considerable attention from half a dozen curious chauffeurs. However, as they had left their cars blocking the road, a harsh, discordant din from those in the rear had been audible for some time, and added to the already violent confusion of the scene. A man in a long duster had dismounted from the wreck and now stood in the middle of the road, looking from the car to the tire, and from the tire to the observers in a pleasant, puzzled way. "See?" he explained. "It went in the ditch." The fact was infinitely astonishing to him, and I recognized, first the unusual quality of wonder, and then the man. It was the late patron of Gatsby's library. How did it happen? He shrugged his shoulders. I know nothing whatever about mechanics, he said decisively. But how did it happen? Did you run into the wall? Don't ask me, said Owl Eyes, washing his hands of the whole matter. I know very little about driving. Next to nothing. It happened. That's all I know. Well, if you're a poor driver, you oughtn't to try driving at night. But I wasn't even trying, he explained indignantly. I wasn't even trying. An awed hush fell upon the bystanders. Do you want to commit suicide? You're lucky it was just a wheel, a bad driver, and not even trying. You don't understand, explained the criminal. I wasn't driving. There's another man in the car.
So Owl Eyes is being accused of driving this car into the ditch, and he's like, I don't drive. I was drinking. I don't know what's happening. I don't know why. I don't know anything about mechanics. I don't know how I got into the ditch, which is funny because it's like mechanics didn't make your car go into a ditch, but okay, fam. So he has this moment, right? And remember, Owl Eyes is the one who said, one brick removed and the whole darn thing will collapse. And then now he has this weird moment of collapse. And that moment of collapse ends up producing him in a ditch going, I don't know what happened. Someone else was driving, and now all of a sudden everything is wrecked. The car is wrecked, and I don't know how. And Nick is going, well, you shouldn't have been driving if you're not a very good driver. And he goes, I wasn't driving. I wasn't driving. Okay, so we're going to pause it there for now because this video is already long enough, and then we'll go ahead and do a part two.